Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Particle Accelerator Podcast, where we talk to future thinking business leaders about how to grow their team and accelerate their business. I'm here today with Adnan. Adnan, would you first make sure I pronounce your name correctly and then also introduce yourself?
Well, thank you very much, Ben. It's Adnan, although I do get confused with Aiden and Adrian a lot. My name is Adnan Khaleel. I've been in the tech space for over 20 years, mostly in the high performance computing space. When you say high performance computing or HPC, it's literally the cutting edge of computational capabilities. Think of weather forecasting, rocket science, aircraft wing design, particle physics, astronomy, all of those areas which are cutting edge. How do you solve some of the most intractable problems on the planet using physics and computation? And now we're seeing a lot of artificial intelligence come into the picture as well.
Yeah, that's great. I'm excited to talk all about that. What I'd love to do is get to know you a little bit. And one of the ways I do that is asking, how did you make your first dollar as a human being? For me, it was a paper route. What was it for you?
It was as a grad student, as an assistantship. I didn't have enough money to pay for everything, and I needed whatever money I could get. I found an assistantship, developed some really good friendships along the way, but that was very first dollar.
What was the assistantship doing?
It was actually working with the National Science Foundation Fund in, I know this is going to sound a bit nerdy, but it was actually as a job, almost as a statistician, looking at the retention of minorities, economically depressed groups, and trying to track their progress through education, starting from high school to higher ed, college, postgrad, and so on. Essentially, trying to understand the effects of various programs that were put in place at the federal level or the state level, and to see what is the impact. Were they having the desired impact? Were we retaining more people who came from less fortunate economic backgrounds to help them progress through college?
The efficacy of those programs. A buddy of mine and I started a company called Arrivalist, and we were looking at the correlation between movement, and we could detect movement through the ad stream. If you were moving around and your IP was changing as you were looking at different ads, then you were in motion. What advertising might you be more interested in? We found a correlation between tourism boards, and we're helping tourism boards attribute that, hey, we ran that campaign and people showed up in our geo. I find that you're more likely to try new brands if you're in motion rather than if you're in your daily routine. Like we were trying to monitor the effectiveness of ad spend on folks that are in motion. And it was really interesting to see that people were actually quite in a mode of adoption as they were moving around.
Right. No, that's very interesting.
Cool. Is there a toy or a hobby that you had as a child that you feel influences what you do career-wise today?
There is, and I think a lot of it I have to attribute to my dad, who had just a very basic carpentry toolkit. And I was fascinated with it. Just screwdrivers, pliers, hammers, nothing exotic. I was probably 2 or 3 years old when I was just so fascinated that you could use these things and create things from it using these tools. And that really set off a journey for me in my mind and in my career, that tools, they're the key to doing more than what you can as an individual. When you think of it philosophically, it's not just the physical tools. I mean, obviously computers, but even utilizing other people's strengths, that's a tool as well. And in the teams that I've run that have been really successful, it's really understanding, what everybody brings to the table. Not everybody is going to be a 5-star contributor, and it's okay. Sometimes when you have a great mix of people and you can leverage their skills, to me, that was the ultimate sort of the genesis of that journey of trying to understand how tools translate to a better working environment, productivity increases, and so on. And when I look around, especially when I'm in technology, it's all about tools. High performance computing, as I mentioned, is a great tool, as is the fundamental physics and mathematics and so on. But, now AI is another tool. And to me, that was really sort of the slippery slope. It all started with the humble screwdriver. And, that's kind of led me to my engineering sort of training, my engineering career. And even though I do a lot of business development and management, I have one foot always on the engineering side, just because to me, that's where I feel really comfortable. It's like
Yeah.
working with tools.
In my 30s, I caught the woodworking bug for a bit. I find that, yeah, you have tools and they work a certain precise way. Wood is kind of like the human equation in software and technology because the wood has grain and it doesn't always do exactly what you want it to do. I always thought woodworking was a pretty good metaphor for life. While the tools are precise, the table saw always cuts the way the table saw cuts, the wood had enough variability for it to be a suitable metaphor for what it's like to work with the software and people and behavior and all of that. If it were maybe for like shelving, and so you use MDF, and MDF is just it's one consistent material. Kind of stinks to work with because it doesn't have that great appearance. But yeah, there's definitely a metaphor there.
I really like what you brought up there. Wood comes in so many different forms, right? You've got pine wood, which is soft, which is easier to work with, but it also deforms. And then you've got some hard, like walnut, which are harder to work with, but if you learn how to work with them, you can produce magical shapes, designs, and patterns in walnut. You mentioned MDF, but one of the other areas I've been looking at is welding, right? Now you're working with metals, and every metal has its own characteristics. Aluminium is soft, steel is hard. And what I've come to sort of appreciate along the way is the tools are important, but it's not a replacement for the knowledge that goes with when you're working with wood. Sometimes you want to cut along the grain of the wood, sometimes you cut across the grain of the wood, depending upon what you're trying to do. And knowing the right tool for the right job. I'm sure you've heard, like, don't use a set of pliers to hammer in a nail. You should just be using a hammer. It's those little tidbits.
I was having this really cool conversation with my 8-year-old. We're coming back from jujitsu and there's a lot of road construction around me. He asked, Dad, if I go into construction, do I need to go to college and can I still make a lot of money? I had been learning something about wisdom and I was like, to make money, all you need is wisdom. Wisdom is 3 components: special knowledge, street smarts, and emotional intelligence. The reason you go to college is to gain special knowledge, to know something deeply about the world and what people have learned before. Street smarts is more about how you assess risk. Should you go to the bad side of town at night? An assessment of risk. And then emotional intelligence is about understanding people and how they might react if you say different things. And he thinks for a minute and he goes, well, Dad, I'm pretty good at school and I think I know about risk. I don't think I take any unnecessary risks. But man, my sister, I just don't understand her. So I got to work on that emotional intelligence. And I was like, well, that may not change. And we had this really
Right.
cool exchange there.
Well, an incredibly mature 8-year-old. I don't think I had that level of awareness when I was 8. I was still fiddling around with my screwdrivers and trying to get to understand, how do I use them properly?
Yeah, cool. So I'd love to get into some of the strategic innovation. You're strategically innovating at scale, and you've worked at some of the most innovative companies, Intel, Google, Dell. What's the biggest difference between how Google, Intel, and Dell approach innovation internally? Is there an ingredient that maybe is different between large companies?
So I've had the benefit of working at all of these great companies. Each one of them is unique. Each one has a different approach to innovation. And that's what I'll say. Like almost every company has its own sort of brand or flavor of innovation. I don't know if you're a fan of Clayton Christensen and disruptive strategy, crossing the chasm and all of that stuff. And when you studied it at business school or wherever you read it, you sort of have in your mind, you create a picture. Innovation is easy. You want to do something different, think out of the box, create something that will upset the current order and things will work. Well, what I've come to realize is every company does this differently. Some companies do it better than others. One of the key ingredients for, innovation or disruption is that you have to have a mindset that really looks at it, much like how, you as a father or a mother are looking at their child saying like, I need to take this undeveloped individual and shape it and allow it to grow. And ultimately it'll develop into something based on your wisdom and knowledge. Innovation is no different. You want to protect innovation within a company. And that's why several companies have something what they call the Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3 funds
Mhm.
based on what the timeline of this innovation actually coming into the marketplaces. So that's one thing. The C-suite or like the executive management has to view this as a very deliberate, concerted effort. It doesn't just happen. It might happen the first time, especially if you're a startup, because your entire new product is based on innovation and disruption. And then you try to build it into a mainstream product. But then what do you do for product number 2? That's what I've witnessed at these big companies, the deliberate way in how you start nurturing these ideas, protect them such that they don't get nixed or canceled by the cash cows of the business or the business units that are generating more money. Typically, they also tend to get more focus at an investment. But if you don't nurture those innovations in a protected environment for long enough, they will die. They need to be protected. I think Google does a great job of it. Intel has its own strengths over here. They've brought some really great technologies, but they've also made some mistakes along the way where I think they were ahead of the curve in terms of bringing the innovation to market. Typically, I think there was a lack of patience in terms of generating revenue. So when they didn't see that happen quickly enough, they moved on to the next innovative project. There is no guarantee that every project is going to succeed, but you have to be patient. I think the best way I've seen innovation succeed is that, you should be patient with it. Don't be impatient for revenue, but be impatient for margin. Make your business process as efficient as possible so that you are generating profits and a sufficient margin profile.
Yeah. You brought up the horizon matrix, and I think that's a good thing just to extrapolate on for the audience. When you're talking about protecting innovation, that usually looks like the ratio. If you think of horizon one as the current set initiatives that we need to drive the business, if we don't do these things well, we may not have a business. Horizon two is, okay, what do we need to do next to keep this going? So you'd see your sales and marketing initiatives, your branding initiatives in Horizon 2. And then Horizon 3 is really the next thing, the 3 to 5 year plan. If we were inside the walls, we probably would have seen too low of a ratio on the third scale. Too much effort swung to Horizon 1 and perhaps Horizon 2. And Horizon 3 was not protected. When they realized Horizon 2 wasn't going to be as effective, it was kind of too late. They hadn't protected that Horizon 3, or perhaps something in Horizon 3 had failed.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. I think the other way that business leaders should be looking at innovation is if you see your competition doing something and you try to react, it's too late. By the time you spin up your business unit that's trying to react to this threat in the marketplace, and then trying to beat the competition, it's a long road. They already have a first mover advantage. You see Apple do this all the time. They're never the first to market. They learn from mistakes in the marketplace and then do a really good job of putting everything together and making a superlative project that nobody else can touch. Similarly with Intel, like Intel had many initiatives within the company on accelerators for AI and for various things like GPUs. There was underinvestment in some of those areas. It's not that they didn't see the market developing with GPUs. They had to focus more on the compute side of the business because that's what made them the most money, and they felt there was a lot of value to deliver. Now, what was happening is the market never stands still, right? The market is always changing, and sometimes even the best amongst us get the rug pulled from underneath our feet. NVIDIA was a really small, tiny company in the 90s, and they were grabbing a lot of market share with AI, GPUs, and training. And Intel tried to react. NVIDIA had done a great job of building a moat around it in terms of the software and the adoption such that people really didn't want to move to an alternative platform. And that's the same challenge that you see with a company like AMD, although they are in a much better position than Intel was to address that challenge. But that's what you have to really deal with. Now, on the other hand, I know we're very much in the tech sector, but a great example of like what is, when you look at innovation and disruptive technologies, what NVIDIA is doing today is great because not only are they focusing on AI and the data center business and the gaming business, where they've got an extremely strong market share position, they're also looking at robotics. Now, this is in many ways an emerging market, and there aren't any real serious competitors to some of the things that they're bringing in that space. They're looking at these accelerators and how it translates to the needs of the robotics market. Clearly, there is a push towards adopting robotic technology. But what I was going to also say is even a company like Apple, when they introduce a new product and it doesn't too well, people look at it and, oh, Apple's lost its mojo and its magic. But no, I think that's very much part and parcel of innovation. Not every project is going to succeed. Some of them will fail, but I think it's important to have enough of these in the pipeline such that one of them will really hit a home run. So, like
Yeah.
the Vision Pro, was it a success? I think they're learning a lot from it. It's not to say that the next generation of it might not be better and more successful. People are really disappointed that the Apple car, yeah, even though there wasn't any official announcement on that product, that it was cancelled. Apple sort of has again lost its innovative streak. And I think this is all part of innovation. You have to take those risks and you have to have that mindset.
I had some really good buddies. I'm in the Dallas area, and so Sabre is headquartered here. And Sabre, for those people that don't know, is big in the travel industry. A bunch of travel brands rely on their platform heavily. One of my buddies was in the Sabre lab, a business unit doing 10 and 1,000-day tests. A 10-day test might be what's the minimum work we can do, essentially a sprint of work to validate whether our idea is worth pursuing it. Is there a there around our innovation thesis? And so they would put a plan together to execute something that gave them even a biased data that this is a good idea, and they would run some testing through the product to see if there was interest. A 100-day test would solidify it further to really validate if we should do a 1,000-day initiative to make it a permanent part of the product. I always thought that was really cool, like small, medium, and large, using a small to dictate the large. I think that's harder to do with consumer electronics because assembly lines it's hard to do the 10-day test,
Right.
especially in today's market with VC funding being more constrained or at least more biased towards certain types of innovation. Bootstrapping ideas are coming back. How can I validate my idea and find my market before I've expended too much capital to prove out whether or not I want to do this? That's just what came up for me as you're talking about those different approaches.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the case. But I think it's also too easy to get caught up into. And here's another problem I've seen at some companies is analysis paralysis, where they are looking for data to validate each and every decision. Sometimes the data for something just does not exist. I mean, one simple case would be like, when Andy Grove and the guys at Intel were starting Intel in the early 70s, did they know microprocessors were going to be the next big thing? They didn't. They had no idea. They just had a hunch. It was going to be an interesting piece of technology. Wanting data to validate everything can be detrimental to innovative thinking because sometimes you just do not have that information. You may have some data from another industry, which could be a parallel that you could use as a comparable, but sometimes there is no substitute for risk and having a risk-taking appetite. And that's what you see, what's great about investments, especially in startups in the United States versus Europe, is because there is an inherent element of risk that's acceptable to the investors in the US versus in Europe. They're a lot more conservative and it's unacceptable. So that's why you see startups flourishing.
Yeah. At Intel, you convinced CEO Pat Gleisner to join the Risk V consortium. How did you build internal consensus for strategies that might seem counterintuitive?
Yeah, and again, it wasn't just me, it was several people involved in this thing, me, my team, and so on. But what you really have to do is support your thesis with enough data. And again, in this case, like for example, this is a very hypothetical situation. What would happen if, what is the cost of Intel not participating? Right. And, one immediate outcome that you can think of as well, there's going to be a community around open source. And you've seen how open source really succeeded in the software space, right? If Steve Ballmer's one mistake, if you can point it out, is that he really didn't believe in Linux, whereas Satya Nadella to Linux and the open source movement. And you saw that as a community as a whole, everybody was embracing open source on the software side. Similarly, Risk 5 was open source hardware specification, a technology, if you will. And even though it takes more effort to do something with hardware, with open source hardware than you do with software, software anybody can write on their laptop and you can deploy it. With hardware, you actually have to design it. It has to be made somewhere. It has to be fabbed somewhere. We felt that there was enough community support behind an open source hardware processor specification like RISC-V that we felt we would be missing the boat if Intel did not participate. We can be a part of the consortium. We can help shape it. We can contribute IP that we feel is complementary and helps the open source community achieve its goals. And you don't have to give your key jewels away, but you want to be supportive of the community's efforts. Now, in the medium to the long term, my goal was to really have the RISC-V community look towards Intel as a steward of helping mature the technology, but also giving its foundry as a place for developing RISC-V based products. And I felt that was a great synergy because one thing Pat was, he was very focused on the synergy between design and the fab side of Intel. Even now, the fab was only servicing Intel's needs, but there was this desire to open it up to the broader market and have it be a third-party fab so that anybody could bring their designs and fabricate it there. Just like you have Taiwan Semiconductor Company, which they create chips for Apple, Nvidia, AMD, and so on. So I felt there was definitely a play there with RISC-V because it was different. It was outside of the norm. Open source hardware still had a little bit of maturing to do, so if Intel got into the game early on, it would set itself apart from the other players.
What's one of the coolest results you've seen from that open sourcing? Is there something that folks could generally connect with that, like, if we hadn't done this, this particular product might not exist? Like, wow, this is really cool because of the RISC-V initiative, these things were able to come up in the market.
Yeah. So right now, when you look at Intel and its proprietary x86 technology, which you see in Xeons and in Pentium, you don't have collaboration happening in the design of the chip itself, just because everything is proprietary. Only Intel and a couple of other companies like AMD have the license to do anything with x86. But the beauty of open source is you can use it to collaborate. And especially in today's world where modularity is a very key driver of innovation, you can have one entity working on a part of the chip, which could be the central processing unit. You could have another entity working on the AI accelerator, another entity working on the GPU. And you can bring these all together as a single SoC or a system on a chip. It's really hard to do that otherwise. It's not to say there aren't some closed source solutions where you can buy intellectual property from other companies that provide this, like Synopsys and Cadence and ARM, which is another company, and build your own product. But you generally cannot change those designs internally as you could with an open source RISC-V thing. If you needed to add a special feature, it's very unlikely that a company like Intel would add that feature just for you. If you can tweak the hardware design yourself, you could add something that you need, and somebody else could take it and add something they needed. The economics of producing these designs today make it work, especially when you have companies like TSMC that can do the fabrication for you.
Yeah, that's really cool. You also pioneered Crane's expansion. Now, first off, I saw that, Cray computing is something that I might be a little bit too old to understand. But you pioneered Crane's expansion into AI, data analytics with YARC data. How do you know when it's the right time to make a big bet on an adjacent market?
Yeah, to say I pioneered it is probably stretching it too far, but I was definitely one of the people pushing to make it a reality. Cray had a very strong position when it comes to supercomputing, especially with the national labs, the DoD, the DOE, and so on. But one of the things that was very evident is that it was all in scientific computing, and there was only so much money to be made in that space. We also saw some emerging market trends, data analytics. It wasn't necessarily AI so much at the time. This is in the 2007, 2008 timeframe. Data analytics was becoming to be a lot of interest in the enterprise space. Companies like banks or insurance companies were looking at analytics as their next big way of trying to gain insight and look for patterns in the data that they have collected over the past 5 years on either customer data or something else, and see if that could give them some insights. In meeting with a lot of customers and seeing the potential of something like this, we clearly felt the need that we needed a class of supercomputers that were easy to deploy, easy to work with and program, fit into the standard data center, was also easy for the standard enterprise IT people to work with. So in other words, it had to Java compatibility and it worked with a variety of databases. But you also wanted it to produce something that was actionable. The thing that we had done in that time frame was we saw graph analytics, which is a particular type of analytics which uses information being put into a graph such that it allows you to see the connections from various points. Even if they're weak connections, you can traverse a graph and look at how one thing might be connected to something else. It's not readily obvious if you don't have it in that particular format. And again, AI is in many ways some kind of a statistical graph, and it's doing some of these things behind the scenes. But at the time, graph analytics, the entry path into looking for these weak connections and trying to look for things that were correlated and understand what was the causation model. And once you understood that, then you had some interesting business prospects and ideas that you could act on. And that's really what we were trying to do with York Data. Have an appliance that allowed you to put your data into a graph analytics format that you could then query and ask it interesting questions. It was, unfortunately, you couldn't ask it an English question like you can do with ChatGPT today, but you could write a query. And if you had a database of individuals where they traveled to, and you had some information on their telephone records, you could say, give me a list of everybody who has traveled to Washington, D.C. and has talked to somebody within a 5-mile radius. And it'd give you a list of every individual in that database. To do something like that in a traditional environment was really hard. But you could do this on a very ad hoc basis. As your ingenuity struck, the analyst could type in a new query and get some more results that they would then dig deeper into, which was really innovative at the time.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think, the graph is interesting. We worked on some email forensics with a graph database to see how we could catch even interpersonal relationships. That relationship was going on in the company that had nothing to do with the hierarchy of the business, and some external relationships with competitors and various people, just how the company as an organism is actually working. Even
Right.
just analyzing the graph on email and going like, wow, there's a lot of relationships that we didn't even understand existed. You're now involved in the quantum computing initiative at Google. I'm sure it's a big team. How do you build strategies around technologies that are still a ways out? My sense is that quantum computing is still 5, 10 years for mainstream adoption. How do you build strategies around something that's a little further out, like definitely an emerging tech bet?
And especially at a company like Google, that's an interesting question because Google has its own initiatives in quantum, but there's so many different other technologies outside. Other companies are doing. Intel had its own quantum initiative. There's other companies like Quantinium, and there's different modalities like, trapped ion versus photon versus silicon and so on. Speaking in terms of generalities, when you have a technology that's very far from practical deployment, a good approach is to not put too many eggs into one basket and to keep your eyes open to how the market is developing. As much as I'd like for one technology to win over another, I also know that it's not sometimes the technology itself which can cause it to fail or to succeed. There's lots of things beyond and outside of my control that causes something to succeed. Right. And this is kind of an engineering paradox because when you look at computer architecture in the late 1990s, the DEC Alpha was considered to be by far the superior microprocessor at its time because it had all the elements that you needed. But in many ways, it didn't really succeed. And it was Intel's x86, which people thought was too complicated, that ultimately went on to become the largest microprocessor by market share in the world today. It's not to say x86 was horrible. It was just in comparison to something else, people didn't think it was the leading technology for its day. It's going to be similar with quantum. It's not just the technology itself, but the ecosystem around it. There's going to be a lot of software. There's going to be a lot of different providers of hardware. There's the enablement. How does all of this come together? When I look at these technologies, to me, it's really being a part of that ecosystem. That way, you don't miss out if any one of these technologies seems to be winning horse. You can quickly adapt and move in that direction. Whereas if you're a startup in quantum technology, you are putting all of your eggs in one basket. But, larger companies have this luxury of working with a lot of different companies as part of an ecosystem and focusing on growing that ecosystem and building awareness. A lot of the work we do today, even outside of Intel, when it comes to quantum technology, is building awareness and getting your customers and potential customers to be more aware of what the reality of the technology is, what should they be looking at, how do they get ready so they aren't caught off guard, especially because many companies are looking at it. I keep on telling some of the large companies, like, for example, if FedEx is looking at quantum technology, and I'm sure UPS would also be interested in looking at it just because there could be a lot of competitive potential if FedEx just had an automatic leg up. It's really about making sure that anybody who has even a slight interest, that they sort of evaluate the technology. And that's where we work with a lot of the C-suite and the decision makers and inform them really what is the potential of the technology and what should they be doing. We typically don't say go ahead and spend tens of millions of dollars on quantum because it's going to be a while, anywhere from 5 to 10 years. But at the same time, you don't just sit on your hands. You see your competitors are benefiting from quantum and you haven't done anything, it could be a little too late. So we just want everybody to be prepared. And that's really the strategy: building awareness, educating the environment, building an ecosystem, and may the best technology win out there is really our approach.
Yeah, cool. So I'm always interested in lessons learned. What's been your biggest strategic miscalculation and what did you learn from it?
In terms of miscalculation, it's about understanding the market and reacting to the changes in the market. It's not an easy thing. There are ways you can mitigate it and look at your exposure to certain things. I mean, as humans, one of the things we are really bad at is we are optimistic, in fact, too optimistic, that we really don't think about the risks as much as we should. And not only the risks, but what do you do in the event of something happening? A great lesson to me is the Challenger disaster, where sometimes you think the engineers can be too conservative, but with the Challenger failure was really one of those rings that weren't designed for that temperature profile and ultimately failed with catastrophic consequences. And, that's just an extreme example, but it's things of that sort that sometimes it's really easy to overlook the points of failure in a system. Even the best amongst us might be able to identify single points of failure, but when you have closely coupled failures, it's really hard to anticipate and to account for some of those things. You see that in the marketplace a lot. You just have to be quick to pivot. Don't be too stuck on your strategy. The biggest lesson learned is the strategy that got you to be successful initially is not the strategy that is going to enable you to be successful for the next 5 years. Don't be so beholden to your strategy that you're not flexible, that you don't see the signals in the marketplace and don't react. If we were to put this in context, Intel is clearly a case study. CPUs made them successful for the past 2 to 3 decades. But going forward, you clearly needed a new strategy, that looked beyond CPUs. And that's where I think they could have done a bit more work. Strategy is not a fixed thing. Your strategy has to be fluid. It has to change. It has to adapt. And you have to adapt.
Well, cool. Just to draw this to a close, if people liked what you had to share today, how would you like them to connect with you?
They can connect with me on LinkedIn. My email address is also available there. I'd love to have some more conversations with folks. I'm always open to expanding my network.
Yeah. And who are you most interested in having conversations with?
Innovators is always interesting, but even people who are trying to scale, right? I mean, one of the things, again, this is my charter and my current role is scaling. That's a very different beast than some of the things I've done in the past. It's one thing to take a business from nothing to 10 million, but then to take it from 10 million to 100 million or 500 million, that's a completely different ballgame. And it's all kinds of business challenges. Like, I obviously like to talk technology. I'm always interested in that, but I'm also interested in speaking with business leaders and understanding their perspective and seeing if I can help them or learn something from them as well.
Yeah, it's great. Well, I really appreciate having you on. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Your deep experience across these major companies has been enlightening. Most of us don't get to think about what a microchip is actually doing. And we just kind of like, okay, with the computer turned on and it's computing. But it's been great to hear your perspective. And I really appreciate your time.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this podcast. Thank you very much for having me on.
Great.